All right, we're going to move on to part 4 of chapter 9. There's a couple different topics we're going to be talking about for that. For one, we're going to talk about something that's really called, it's not truly what we would call a Mendelian. It's kind of like non-Mendelian genetics. And this is where we have this intermediate phenotype. So all of Mendel's P's crosses were complete in that the dominant completely covered the recessive. But in this case, we're going to see where the hybrid, the heterozygous, actually looks in between both parents. Right, so this is called incomplete dominance. So this is another inheritance pattern. So we've talked about complete dominance, we've talked about autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, and now we're going to talk about incomplete dominance. So incomplete is where we have this red and white. This is a flower, a snapdragon. And with this snapdragon, and it only happens in certain flowers, not all flowers do this, but in this particular flower, if you take a homozygous red and cross it with a homozygous recessive white, you get a hybrid, a heterozygous that is in between in color. It's kind of like we don't have quite enough pigment to get that true red color, so we end up with a pink. And we can see here with our hybrid, if this was truly a blending theory, if we were to cross a pink with a pink again, they would all be pink. But if we cross a pink and a pink, so notice here I have big R, little r, big R, little r, I get my red and white back. So I get a 1-to-1 ratio. 25% are red, 50% are pink, and 25% are white. So this is incomplete dominance. So like I said, it does not support the blending theory because again, the F2s would all be pink and we didn't get that. We got the red and the white back. An example of this in humans is a term called hypercholesterolemia. And this is where you have dangerously high levels of cholesterol, and the heterozygous individual may have an intermediate, a moderate form of this disease. So we have normal, so homozygous, big H, we have enough receptors here to get those LDLs, the low density lipoproteins, that's your cholesterols, the bad fats here, out of the bloodstream and into the cells, where if you have your homozygous recessive, you don't have those receptors. And so those LDLs sit inside your bloodstream and then they accumulate and form plaques, which clog your arteries. And then we have the mild, and this is where they have like half the number of receptors. So they're kind of in between both phenotypes. We also have this thing that where we may have more than two choices. So far, we've only talked about two options: tall, short, red, white, purple, white, or I'm listing all these flower colors. Let's do peas, green, yellow, axial, terminal, wrinkled, smooth. In your one lab, you had yellow versus black in your corn, but sometimes you have more than two options. You may have three, and this is called a multiple or multi-allelic. So for instance, in humans, we have three different alleles. We have A, B, and O. We have four blood types because we have this situation called codominance. And codominance is not like incomplete. Incomplete was a blend. Codominance means we see both the dominant and recessive. If we are the heterozygous, we see both phenotypes. So in codominance, like I said, we don't have, one is not dominant over the other. We see both. And so the heterozygous, you see both proteins being made and expressed. So the AB blood type is an example of codominance. We don't get something in between A and B. We see the A proteins and we see the B proteins. So in this picture here are those proteins, or the sugar. We can call them a glycolipid. It's a sugar ID tag on the surface of your red blood cells. They are not spiky or circular. They're just modeling this so you can understand it. If you have the A tag, if you have the blood, A type blood, you have B if you're blood type B. If you're AB, you have both. And so your body recognizes both of those ID tags. If you have O blood, you do not have either. So your body will not recognize any of these ID tags and it will attack it as a foreign invader inside your body. So it's kind of nice for O blood, there's no ID. So you can stick O blood in anybody because there's no ID tags to cause that reaction. If you have AB blood, you can take any blood. You're the universal acceptor. You can throw any blood into them. Versus if you have A, you cannot take B or you cannot take AB because those B receptors will not be identified and it will cause a severe reaction in the body. So and here's that clotting we're showing here. So if I had A and took the anti-B, we can see the blood would clot if you have those B, you put the B antibodies in there. The same thing with B, you're going to clot if you have A. AB doesn't clot at all. O can only take O blood or they all clot, and that would be a problem. Pleiotropy is where one gene influences more than one characteristic. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about sickle cell, but sickle cell is a human example. It affects hemoglobin and the shape of the red blood cell. It'll actually cause a sickle shape, and I'll show you in the next slide. It causes anemia and organ damage. Both the sickle cell and the non-sickle, they're codominant. So we're not going to see like an in-between. It's not incomplete. So it's not like we get an in-between sickle shape red blood cell. It means that some of the red blood cells are normal and some of them will do the sickle. And so we have noticed that if you are heterozygous, you actually also, it kind of infers this resistance to malaria. So we'll talk about this natural selection of this particular trait when we get to that chapter. But just know that if you're heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, you will also have the ability to survive malaria. So here's a picture of the normal red blood cells, and here's the sickle. And then here are some of the effects that you can have. Once they sickle, your body has to break those red blood cells down and make new ones, which is why you have these signs of anemia, because your red blood cell count drops. And so here are the different problems you can have. So if you are homozygous for sickle cell anemia, you're going to have a really difficult time and you're going to have problems with this disorder. If you're heterozygous, you have mild symptoms, but you also have this advantage over malaria if you live in an area that has malaria. Polygenetic means that there are more than one gene that influences that characteristic. For instance, eye color, there are 4 or 5 different genes, and for skin color, there are 3. So we're going to look at those different scenarios here. I like to do this particular characteristic. We're going to talk about eye color, which is kind of on the side, but a lot of students are fascinated with that. But first, let's talk about skin color. We talk about skin color, not only does it have 3 different genes, A, B, and C, but it's also incomplete dominance. So you see in that F1 generation, an in-between color between the really light or white color skin versus the very dark and black color skin. So if we were to do a Punnett square with 3 genes, that's a 64 square. And you can see all the different colors here from the light all the way to the dark. So we go from the recessive to the dominant. And then we have this nice bell-shaped curve where we can see where most of our individuals are kind of in the middle here. That's due to that incomplete dominance. And we have some that are light in color, and then we have some that are dark in color. So eye color is another one that is polygenic. So with the polygenic trait, we know we have all these different colors of eyes. When we truly only have, you could say it's multi-allelic. We have 3 forms here. You either have brown, you produce brown pigment, you produce blue pigment, or you don't produce pigment at all, which gives you can see the blood vessels in the iris, so they appear red. So brown, you produce a lot of melanin, where blue, you're going to produce a small amount of melanin. And again, this all has to do with the wavelength of light that it's reflecting. And because it has less melanin and it's also in a different layer of the iris, it reflects back blue light versus the brown pigment reflecting. It's absorbing the other colors, right, and reflecting what we see. But knowing this does not explain all the different variations in color. So we know there are at least 3 genes, 3 that are responsible for eye color, 2 of which are on chromosome 15, and you have two alleles. So you can't say this is like truly multi-allelic. You do have two alleles per gene. Okay, so in the BAY2, you can either have brown or blue. In the BAY1, you have brown or absent. In the GEY or GE or however you want to pronounce it, it is green. Green is just a little variation of the blue, but it is dominant. It probably has more melanin, so it will cover up the blue. So that's why I have the green is capitalized. It is dominant over blue. So if you have blue eyes, I can tell you your phenotype is blue eyes, right? Your genotypes are the genes you have. I can tell you what your genotype is because you have to be completely recessive. So you have to have blue from mom, blue from dad, absent from mom, absent from dad, and blue from mom and blue from dad. So blue, blue, absent, absent, blue, blue, blue eyes. So if you have two blue eye parents, their children better all be blue eye or someone's got some explaining to do. Okay. Because they're homozygous recessive in all three genes. For brown eyes, okay, move my face here. For brown eyes, if you have one, just one, you just need one brown gene and you have brown eyes. So I have no idea what your genotype is. You could be brown, blue, absent, absent, doesn't matter. You could be blue, blue, absent, brown. As long as you get in these four positions, you get one brown, you have brown eyes. Doesn't matter whether it's green or blue or whatever down here. So there are so many different combinations that you could have if you have brown eyes. But this is how you can have two brown-eyed parents. They could have the right combination to have a blue-eyed child. It is possible. It is genetically possible. Now, green eyes is very much so like the blue, but so they have blue, they have to have blue, blue, absent, absent, and then they just need one green. So they could be green, green, or green, blue, but green is dominant. So it will cover up that blue. Now you may notice we don't have a lot of people with green eyes. And the reason why we don't is because of this other gene. And that's called hazel. So you kind of have the green on the outside and then you get the brown in the middle here. And they believe that there is another gene called the modifier gene. And if you are big M or big M, little m, so homozygous dominant or heterozygous, you will not have green eyes. So you'd have everything would be the green eyed because you'd think you'd have more green eyed people than blue eyed, right? Green is dominant for blue. Well, we kind of do if you consider the hazel. There's so many people with hazel eyes. And so they're either homozygous for that modifier or heterozygous. Now, in order to be the true green, they have to be homozygous recessive for that modifier gene. So that's that little m, little m. So they'd have to be blue, blue, absent, absent, green, green, little m to get that green eyed versus one big M and they've got hazel. Now this is violet. Violet is very rare. It is a real eye color. It, like I said, they believe that the genotype is very similar to blue eyes. It may have just a little bit different, maybe a different layer or just a different hint of melanin that gives it that purple color. Now, I have a lot of students that also ask me about heterochromia. Now, heterochromia is where you have two different color eyes. And so when you have two different color eyes, like David Bowie had two different color eyes, but if you notice, his pupils are also different sizes, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. So when we talk about two different color eyes, or the eye could have half of the one eye is one color and the other half of the same eye is a different color. We also think it could be caused by females with chimerism, and we'll talk about chimerism and the inactivation of the X chromosome in that miscellaneous unit. But it doesn't explain why males would have heterochromia. So trauma, sometimes you can have what's called trauma, and that's where if you have damage to your eye and you bleed into the iris, it stays there, kind of like a tattoo. And that is, in fact, what happened to David Bowie. So David Bowie actually had two blue eyes, and then he was in a bar fight. So you can see, not only did he have blood staining of his iris to give him the different color, but he also did damage, and you can see that his pupil is kind of blown. And so he's not able to dilate that eye properly, or was not able to dilate. So he was probably very sensitive in that one eye to light. We also have some medical conditions that affects pigment production. And so, of course, the iris is that production making pigment. And so you can see heterochromia could be due to that type of condition as well. There are also environmental factors that can affect certain characteristics, like, for example, skin color. You all know that as you get more sun, your skin gets darker. There are also things like susceptibility to diseases such as cancer that has to do with heredity and environmental components. In fact, we can see that identical twins will actually show some differences based on environment. Some of you guys may know that certain flowers will be different colors based on the soil pH. So there are other genetic influences that we can talk about, or other outside of genetics that can contribute or to alter different types of characteristics or traits. Right. So make sure you do your practice on incomplete and codominance so that you fully understand those topics. And that is it for part 4. I think that's what we're on. I'm losing track. We have so many parts to this chapter. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and talk to me.